Alrighty. Well, welcome everyone to the South Idaho chapter's June conversation. We're super excited to welcome our guest Maria, and we look forward to learning about her work reporting on clean energy for Canary Media. So for those of you who are new or don't know about us, the Climate Reality Project is a community of climate activists from all political stripes who are stepping up to address climate change. We're putting solutions into policy agendas at federal and local levels of government, and our movement is composed of everyday Americans concerned about passing on a healthy economy and environment to the next generation. If you're not already a part of our chapter, we really encourage you to join our movement. The South Idaho chapter consists of Idahoans and Oregonians who acknowledge climate change as a threat to the next generation of rural Americans, and we're all committed to doing something about it. We have members from all over the Snake River watershed, and we have all come together to support a clean, sustainable, vibrant, innovative Idaho and Oregon. Thanks so much for attending. And I'm gonna, if you're not part of our movement and want to join, I'm gonna go ahead and drop those links in the chat. There you are. And so, like I mentioned, we're really excited to introduce Maria Gallucci, a clean energy reporter for Canary Media. She's previously contributed her writing to Grist, IEEE, Spectrum, Time, and other publications. And Maria is particularly focused on covering difficult to decarbonize sectors like maritime shipping and aviation. And in 2021, she gave a TED Talk on the potential use of green ammonia to power giant cargo ships, which is really interesting. And I'll find the link and drop it in the chat. I totally recommend everyone watches it. So today, Maria is going to focus on her work with hydrogen and its cousin ammonia, which are increasingly being touted as promising solutions for cleaning up cargo ships, commercial jets, heavy-duty trucks, and even steelmaking. She'll chat with us about the exciting new developments in transportation and industry, as well as the many hurdles and questions that still remain when it comes to scaling up these carbon-free fuels. Great, so some housekeeping items. During the presentation, we ask that you please keep your video on if you can, and your microphone on mute. It's really nice for our speakers to actually see people and feel, see their faces and feeling like they're engaging with the people on the presentation and not just like computer screens. And then we'll also hold off questions and comments until the end of the initial presentation, which should be about 20 to 30 minutes or so, at which time everyone's welcome to come off mute and you can ask your question. But you can also go ahead and put your question in the chat at any time, and Bryant will go ahead and lead that Q&A session. So with that, Maria, I'll go ahead and pass it over to you.
Great, thank you so much for that introduction. And hi, everyone. Thank you for joining this chat today. Actually, I was got connected with you all through my TED Talk. Ethan saw it and kind of reached out. And so I'm actually based in New York City myself. But do have a few kind of interesting examples from the West Coast that relate to what I'm talking about. Well, I'll just kind of give you a brief bio about myself. So I'm originally from Columbus, Ohio, and I went to school at Ohio University, studied journalism, and after that I lived in Mexico City for a few years, reporting for a newspaper there. And in 2010, the UN held its climate change conference in Cancun. And since I was there, I kind of joined a media team that covered the press conference. And that was really my first sort of introduction into covering climate change and learning a lot about clean energy topics in depth. And when I moved to New York in 2011, I started writing for Inside Climate News and covering clean energy in depth. And that sort of has put me on this trajectory that I'm on today. Now I'm a reporter for Canary Media, where I focus on all sorts of clean energy topics, but I'm really interested in these hard to decarbonize sectors like shipping and aviation. And in 2017, actually, I did an energy journalism fellowship at the University of Texas at Austin. And the idea behind that was to kind of give a working journalist a chance to take some time to do a deep dive into a particular topic. And my deep dive was on cleaning up cargo shipping. And so through that, I kind of really started focusing on this particular area, started doing more reporting. That ultimately led to the TED Talk and kind of a lot of other stories that I've done since then. And so as we kind of said at the top, hydrogen has a lot of potential applications in industry, but I'm kind of going to primarily focus on heavy duty transportation, just because that's what I've written the most about, but I'm certainly open to any questions you might have or kind of things you're curious about we can kind of elaborate on later. So for hydrogen, the main two big areas where we could see it take off in transportation is for uh, giant cargo ships and for airplanes, because these are two kind of modes of transportation for which alternatives are trickier to use. Like they have extremely large power needs and they need to carry a lot of fuel with them. They also have a lot of kind of complex safety requirements because they're moving people or they're handling cargo. And so, for example, a cargo ship, it's possible definitely to power smaller ferries on batteries alone, but there's sort of a limit to the amount of batteries that you can put on the ship before it actually, the batteries take up all the space that you need for cargo for people. So experts are really looking at hydrogen and ammonia because they kind of pack more punch, as it were. They're more energy dense. You can get more bang for your buck when you put a tank of hydrogen or ammonia on the ship versus a battery or potentially other types of fuels. And shipping and aviation are interesting because so when the UN made the Paris Agreement in 2015 to kind of limit global warming to keep global warming below 2 degrees Celsius, ideally 1.5 degrees, shipping and aviation did not actually sign on to that agreement, and sort of their argument being that they're international, they're very difficult to regulate. So they've set their own standards, or in the process of setting their own standards aligned with the Paris goals. Both aviation and shipping contribute roughly 2 to 3% of the world's annual greenhouse gas emissions, which kind of doesn't seem like a lot in terms of the overall picture, but the challenge, the thing that experts are really concerned about is the fact that these sectors are only expected to get bigger. And if they kind of keep operating the same way they do now, keep using the same fuels, their share of emissions is going to get bigger. Potentially for shipping, it could be up to 17% of global emissions, especially as houses and passenger cars start getting cleaner. They're just going to get bigger and dirtier. And also I wanted to acknowledge too, I know one thing you might be curious about is hydrogen's use in ground transportation for passenger cars. So there's been obviously a lot of interest in using fuel cells and hydrogen for sedans and passenger cars. It seems like now the sort of the favor, it's in batteries' favor. The cost of lithium-ion batteries has declined. A lot of the infrastructure to support charging electric cars is rolling out, and less so for hydrogen. There's only hydrogen refueling stations in California and one in Honolulu. But when it comes to long distance trucking, the verdict is still a little bit out. There's manufacturers like Volvo, which is one of the world's largest truck makers, is still considering hydrogen fuel cells potentially for fueling long distance trucks. So that's an interesting area because it seems like batteries have eclipsed hydrogen and passenger cars, but there's a lot of open questions about these other bigger, harder to decarbonize modes. And so I guess one thing to establish as well is when I'm talking about hydrogen and ammonia, I'm really meaning sort of the green versions of these fuels, ones that are produced using renewable electricity. You might be familiar with sort of this rainbow of different fuels. There's blue ammonia or blue hydrogen and gray and pink and brown. And essentially they're different ways of, that's perfect, thank you. All right, so there are different ways of making these fuels, but when we think about it in the context of decarbonizing and kind of rapidly reducing emissions from transportation and other sectors, sort of the ideal is this first bar, that the green, right, produced via electrolysis. If you're not familiar, electrolysis involves using electricity from wind or solar or what have you to split water molecules into hydrogen and oxygen. And then with ammonia, there are other layers to that process. It starts with electrolysis to make hydrogen. And then there's a process where you pull nitrogen from the air, and then you combine the hydrogen and nitrogen to make ammonia kind of through this high heat, high energy intensive process. And all of that can be powered with renewables. It just, the challenge, I think, for the world and for industries is that we need thousands of gigawatts more renewable energy to make these fuels, not only to produce them for, for transportation, but also to make sure that there's enough for all industries, because ammonia, for example, is used mostly today for fertilizer. So you wouldn't want to be in a situation where you're making ammonia for cargo ships, but you don't have any fertilizer for crops. So you have to kind of rapidly expand in all directions. With hydrogen and ammonia, they're chemical cousins, so they kind of work similarly. You can use them in two different ways. There's the combustion engine, so that's what we use in cars and ships and planes today, or there's fuel cells, and which I've already been talking about. But fuel cells essentially use hydrogen or ammonia to create a chemical reaction that produces electricity, and the electricity then drives the motors, and in the case of a ship or plane, turns the propellers. So rather than burning the fuel, you're making electricity. And there are pros and cons to both of them. I think the pro with engines is that compared to fuel cells, they produce more power. And so you could sail a ship farther, fly a plane farther using an engine. But the problem is that you're burning the fuel. And even though this doesn't produce carbon dioxide emissions, because hydrogen and ammonia don't contain carbon, there's still other pollution that's produced, smog forming pollutants and greenhouse gases, relatively small amounts, but still, if you're talking about a massive adoption of these fuels, it's important to develop technologies that either avoid or kind of scrub those emissions along the way. Cargo shipping, so that's the area that I kind of focused on a lot in recent years. I really got interested in cargo shipping sort of in a roundabout way. I heard about this effort to revive old-fashioned sailing ships. Essentially, there's these vessels that use only wind power to sail from Europe to the Americas and other parts of the world, the Pacific Island nations. And the idea being that they want to kind of sail the way we used to, the original zero emission sailing. And I thought that was really interesting, and it kind of opened the door to learn about other solutions, because sailing certainly has sails have a role for sure, but when it comes to these enormous hundreds of thousands of ton cargo ships, sails alone probably won't be enough to power them. So what are the other solutions? And that's what I started looking into. And what's challenging for the shipping industry is that for over a century, they've burned oil in combustion engines, and that's worked across the board for all types of ships, from tiny motorboats to enormous container ships or oil tankers or what have you. But when it comes to finding alternatives, it's going to have to be a mix of solutions, because certain fuels will not be, like batteries, for example, they won't be able to go the distance, but it wouldn't make sense to use an extremely expensive fuel like ammonia for a short application, because batteries in that case will work. So it's kind of, the industry is in this process right now of figuring out which ships, which routes, which areas should use which fuel. So it's going to be this kind of big mix, and that makes it complicated, but also it's kind of nice to know that there are other, if ammonia doesn't work for this type of ship, maybe something else will. So ammonia is, as I mentioned, it's commonly used as a fertilizer or to make plastics or other chemicals. Almost all of it today is made using fossil fuels, and actually ammonia production itself is a major contributor of greenhouse gases. So making ammonia with renewable energy is key. It has some advantages, though, that is why shipping experts say it's kind of one of the most promising fuels for these kind of giant, far-reaching cargo ships. It's relatively energy dense, so you don't need to store as much of it on board as you would hydrogen, for example, or batteries. It doesn't create carbon dioxide emissions. And because it already exists around the world, there's this existing infrastructure that potentially ships could tap into, could be expanded to serve the maritime industry. So it's not completely reinventing the wheel. It's just a matter of growing it and making it greener. There are no cargo ships right now operate on ammonia, but there are about a dozen projects in the works that are trying to make the first ammonia powered cargo ships. And industry experts I spoke with say that probably by the early 2030s, so about a decade from now, we could start to see broader adoption of ammonia in newer ships. And there are of course major challenges, not just making green ammonia or kind of resolving these more technical engineering issues, but also safety is a big concern. Ammonia it's toxic, it's corrosive. It can be potentially fatal if you're exposed to high concentrations. So I just saw Ika's comment about pea cycling. Right. I thought that was a really interesting story about kind of other renewable sources of ammonia. But yeah, so the industry, though, I think even though there are enormous safety concerns around ammonia, the industry is also, from the people I've talked to, they take it very seriously because they don't want to introduce a fuel that's going to potentially kill people or destroy the ecosystem, right? That defeats, well, it doesn't just defeat the purpose, it's a bad idea. So they are kind of setting rigorous safety standards and guidelines and kind of taking precautions to make sure that this rolls out safely. And that's a big challenge, but it's one that the industry is already very familiar with. And hydrogen, so hydrogen being a chemical cousin of ammonia, it's also possible to use it in ships as well, but potentially those with a shorter range. Because ammonia is less energy dense, you would need more of it on board. But in some ways, for these shorter range vessels or smaller vessels, it's less complicated. You're not kind of making hydrogen into ammonia. You're just using the ammonia, and that can be used in a fuel cell as well, or an engine. And for my West Coast example, there's actually the nation's, I believe, first hydrogen fuel cell ferry is about to start operating in San Francisco, potentially later this year. And yeah, well, it's changed owners, but it's going to operate around the Golden Gate Bridge area. And so that's really exciting because it's sort of one of the first real world examples, not just a demonstration ship, but something that people will actually be able to kind of board and experience themselves. So definitely can talk a lot more about ships, but I'll move on to airplanes, so in terms of kind of hydrogen or ammonia, airplanes is the focus is primarily just hydrogen. Researchers at the International Council for Clean Transportation, they do a lot of really good work around kind of thinking about and looking at how the role hydrogen can play in aviation. They found that about a third of all passenger traffic could be met with hydrogen flights. So that would primarily be like the shorter medium haul flights, regional flights, but that's a significant share that ammonia powered planes could kind of technically supply. And looking out to 2050, their latest projection is that hydrogen can meet about 1/5 of the total demand from the aviation industry. The remaining 4/5, or almost all of it, they think would likely be from sustainable aviation fuels, which you might have heard about. This is kind of a very broad term, and right now most sustainable aviation fuels, they're essentially biofuels, or are made from discarded cooking oil or animal fats. And the idea being that you can kind of drop them in and blend them with the existing kerosene that's used in jets. But there's a lot of effort to kind of increase the percentage of sustainable aviation fuels used in that blend to ultimately getting to 100% and not using any fossil fuel based fuels or jet fuel. So and then there is probably some role for battery powered planes, they say, but likely very tiny. Again, the same issue with shipping is that in order to meet the power requirements of these vehicles, you would need so many batteries that it would weigh the plane down. There wouldn't be room for passengers. So that's why hydrogen looks promising compared to batteries. Safety again is another pressing concern, but I thought this was interesting. The International Air Transport Association said that there's certain characteristics of hydrogen that actually make it safer as a fuel than kerosene, and other characteristics make it more dangerous. So it's kind of, it's not inherently going to cause a Hindenburg-like explosion, but obviously there are safety steps that need to be taken. And there are several efforts to use hydrogen either in a combustion engine, which is the approach that Airbus, one of the world's biggest aircraft manufacturers, is taking, and a number of startups are looking into using fuel cells. And actually, in Washington State later this year, there's a company called Universal Hydrogen is going to test fly its hydrogen fuel cell aircraft around Moses Lake. And in Hollister, California, a startup called Zero Avia is going to test fly their hydrogen fuel cell plane. And they're also going to test the plane in the UK this summer as well. So hydrogen has been used in aircraft, but in these very tiny experimental planes, and certainly nothing that is commercially viable yet. Some of these startups are claiming that they could enter a hydrogen aircraft into commercial service kind of within the next 2 or 3 years. I guess we'll, see if that happens. There's a lot of steps that need to be, they need to go through to get to that point. And also, so I mentioned Airbus is developing a combustion engine. They recently partnered with Delta. A lot of the major airlines, I think they're coming under a lot of pressure from consumers, from government agencies to actually start dealing with the issue of emissions from aviations. And so they're starting to invest heavily in sustainable aviation fuels. And a few of them, like Delta, British Airways, United Airlines, are also investing in these kind of early stage hydrogen projects as well. So right, as I mentioned, in order for these technologies to succeed, there are the technical and engineering issues that need to be resolved in terms of how do you make it work in an engine, how do you limit pollution, how do you make sure it's safe. There's the sort of massive buildup of renewable energy of wind and solar and other sources to actually produce the hydrogen and ammonia, and to do so without competing with other fuel sources. A lot of the progress around this is happening in the European Union because they have kind of more stringent regulations, or they're starting to pressure their aviation and maritime industries to start addressing their emissions. And they're investing heavily in developing these zero emission technologies. One of the more interesting examples for shipping is Norway. Norway has set a goal to, I believe it's to make all of their ferries fully electric within the coming decades. And ferries play an important role in Norway because of sort of the landscape there. And they're seeing a lot of investment there in battery powered ships, hydrogen fuel cells, ammonia. There are, I believe, 4 green ammonia plants that are planned for Norway, but also some of the countries in the Asian region are also doing a lot of work on this as well. Japan, South Korea, and Singapore are major maritime countries. They import and export a ton of goods. They have a lot of the biggest shipyards. And so they're seeing a ton of investment and development there. The United States, I named a few of these kind of pilot projects by startups, but we don't really have a lot of the sort of the manufacturing and shipbuilding and aviation or sort of the policies that are driving these investments. But certainly when it comes to the companies like Delta or even Amazon, right? Those are US based companies. that are kind of facing pressure from abroad and facing pressure from consumers at home as well. And so that's sort of driving some change there. And I thought, just before I close my kind of my spiel, I thought I'd just mention a few things in case anybody is interested in getting involved, maybe on a personal level. There's the Ship It Zero campaign. They actually work pretty closely, or they're working to kind of pressure the Walmarts and Amazons and IKEAs of the world to kind of commit to using only zero emission ships to import and export their goods. And sort of that's, they have demonstrations outside of Target's headquarters, and they kind of really are trying to pressure individual companies because that seems to be the most tangible way, as somebody who shops at one of these stores, that sort of gives you a more direct line than kind of pressuring the engine manufacturer in Denmark or something like that. The Sustainable Aviation Buyers Alliance is working in a similar way. It's kind of these companies like Microsoft or Netflix or Salesforce who are participants, whose employees fly a lot for work or kind of contribute a lot to their sort of corporate carbon footprint, are working to kind of collectively invest in sustainable aviation fuels and other technology. And I would say also, I know I didn't talk very much about trucking, but that is probably the way that a lot of us see and feel the impacts of transportation, especially with Amazon, other companies building giant warehouses. I know there's one kind of not too far from me in Brooklyn that just went up. And so kind of learning about how policymakers, how companies are thinking about, how are they going to account for that influx of trucking traffic, the pollution that comes with it, the congestion, et cetera. That's sort of one area as well to sort of get involved in and kind of think about ways that alternative fuels could play a role sort of in our backyards in that way. So I'll stop there. And I suppose if anybody wants to ask a question, feel free to just go ahead and do that. And I'll take a look at the chat as well.
Yeah, thanks, Maria. So I want to kick off the questions real quick here because you just touched on policy, and so I want to start the conversation about policy. And from your perspective and what you're seeing, does ammonia and hydrogen, the creation of them, require government policy? What types of policy are needed to allow these technologies to break out of their niche that they're in right now? Like, is this something that it doesn't need to be a policy or government-driven effort, or is the private sector ready and the market ready to commercialize ammonia and hydrogen technologies?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and I think that policy is going to be essential because. And I don't remember the exact numbers off the top of my head, but I know that sort of the green versions of hydrogen and ammonia costs multiple times more to produce, at least right now, than sort of the dirtier versions. And so policies that either stipulate the use of greener fuels or support the development of renewables of these projects will be important because and also policies that require ships to use alternative fuels as well, because right now, if you're a cargo shipping company and you say, well, I'm going to use green ammonia, even though it's infinitely more expensive, that will obviously make, you'll be less competitive as a company. And so there's not really any incentive for an individual company to go out and do that. So policies that, I guess, level the playing field is kind of the common term, but policies that sort of don't punish any individual company, but sort of share that sort of cost burden toward decarbonizing will be really important. And there's all sorts of estimates floating around, but one that I can remember off the top of my head for renewable energy production to make ammonia and other sort of e-fuels could be hundreds of billions of dollars by 2050. And I know numbers, context is helpful to understand how much will we be spending otherwise, but it's a significant step up from what we would be spending today. So Right, Paul, and that's why you're seeing a lot of the producers in Europe in particular start to actually look into this and develop plans to build plants because they are under pressure to do so.
Okay. So we have a question about extracting ammonia from sewage and sanitation sources that Ethan asks, and this is actually very relevant in COVID as well, because we can monitor COVID spikes through our sewer systems. Have you heard that? Is there an opportunity to use that naturally occurring system?
That's actually a great question, and it's not one that I'm very familiar with. But it would, and was it Ethan? Somebody cited Patty cited the P cycling article, which was great, and I think in general, kind of very broadly speaking, when it comes to recycling or reusing sort of existing materials, a big challenge is that it costs money to do that, to gather the resources to purify them or clean them up and then distribute them. And so in many cases, it's a step that companies they don't consider it worth taking because of the added expense. But it would be, when you think about, even as I just said, how costly it is to make new green ammonia, that could be an interesting pathway. I'll look into that one.
Speaking of green ammonia and the rainbow that we have up here, what renewable energy technologies are we talking about when we're creating green ammonia or green hydrogen? Is it geothermal, solar, wind, nuclear? What are the, because I hear a lot about the natural gas industry promoting hydrogen production, but they're a carbon emitting source of energy.
Right, and that's why, as you see on the rainbow, what blues from natural gas with carbon capture and storage. I think, and that's a tricky one because carbon capture and storage is something that hasn't really delivered or been shown to kind of work on a broad scale. So there's questions about, if it would actually do so in this case as well. Green ammonia, generally you hear about wind, solar, geothermal, hydropower. Hydropower is actually probably going to be the biggest source of renewables used to make green ammonia in the kind of Nordic countries, Northern Europe region, because they have so much of it, as well as geothermal. And then nuclear is also a possible option. I guess in that case, as you see on the rainbow, it's pink then, but I guess it would still be in the carbon-free umbrella.
Okay. Ethan, do you want to ask your question about the fuel cell process being better? You might have more to offer there on that question.
Sure. So I just didn't understand how a fuel cell is actually produced, and if it requires the same amount of precious minerals that a battery does, which kind of sullies the process of battery power if we're having to do this resource intensive extractive process where we're scraping the ground throughout third world countries, and all the things that make you feel dirty about using a battery. Is the fuel cell a simpler process that doesn't use those precious minerals, or is it pretty similar to a battery in how it's designed?
Mm-hmm. That is an excellent question, and I don't fully know the answer to it, but I do know fuel cells do use a lot of the same materials. I'm not sure how intensive they are compared to a battery, but fuel cells generally do use batteries in the sort of larger powertrain. Sometimes it's to regulate kind of the power flows or kind of extend the range. Batteries do a better job at kind of the abrupt starting or braking in a system than fuel cells do. So there's usually combined, it's just a matter of how much battery power you have. But that's a really interesting question, and I'm guessing I haven't really thought about it so much before because batteries are the production of batteries is so much bigger, right? Or at least projected to be so much bigger. But it would be really interesting to think about if there was sort of a resource an advantage resource wise to using a fuel cell. They do, but they do use some, at least some of the same materials.
Thanks. Yeah, I just imagine a fuel cell looking like some really, futuristic little plate with like some tubes moving things back and forth, but I have no idea what a fuel cell actually looks like.
Yeah, it's funny because I've seen them, but you usually just see the box that contains them. So it's like this mystery box.
We'll have to get Geordie LaForge on, and maybe it looks like the warp drive of the Enterprise or something. So another question that comes up is the Biden administration is announcing these energy earth shots, is what they're calling them. And I think they planned to announce 6 or something. They've announced 3 of them, and one of them is the hydrogen earth shot, and it's to try to reduce costs by 80% for the creation of hydrogen. Do you have any insight as to how that earth shot is progressing, what the Biden administration and the U.S. federal government are doing to reach this presidential priority that they've announced?
Yeah, so they are, I believe companies are still in the process of applying for these hydrogen hubs or the hydrogen earth shot program. So it is advancing, but it's a matter, I guess, of them kind of picking which ones to support. I actually got coffee with somebody last week who is applying for support from the hydrogen hub program. It's a company called High Store, and they have an interesting proposal to store hydrogen in salt formations in Mississippi, in the way that I guess natural gas is currently stored this way in some places as well. But Mississippi has geological formations that make it favorable to storing hydrogen. And so their thought is kind of, you can make a lot of it, store it underground, and pipe it to ports to fuel ships, or to use in emergency power crunch situations. So that's one project, and they are working to apply for that as well. And I think it's interesting to see it actually to see how it helps reduce the cost, because they want to dramatically reduce the cost of hydrogen to like $1 per unit or something like that, which would obviously have a huge kind of accelerating impact on the industries.
And it actually brings up a good question. I don't know, should we think about it in hydrogen in terms of gallons? Like when $5 or $7 a gallon for gas, depending on where you live. Is that the way the consumer should think about it? You mentioned unit, but like, how should the consumer think about, if we're the end user and we're filling up our car with hydrogen, what does it look like to us?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I mean, I think we usually talk about production in terms of metric tons, but right from a consumer side, if you're filling up your car, probably say like equivalent gallon, something like that. I know like natural gas, you have the BTUs, but that's not, I think in this case, we think about it in terms of tonnage, tons, and then gallons for the kind of consumer side.
Okay, so when you said like they want to try to bring the cost down to $1, would that would be less than the price of gasoline, or is that the goal?
I'm not sure. Yeah, I said unit because I couldn't remember exactly the same unit, but I don't know. Well, I mean, the price of gasoline is interesting, right? Because it's a lot higher than it is. But I think they're talking about reducing that for sort of the production side, and not necessarily like the retail side, like the price that it would sell for at the pump. It's the cost of how much it costs to make each unit of hydrogen.
Okay. And then this next question is, so there's a lot of excitement around hydrogen. A lot of it is actually coming from the fossil fuel industry. Is the excitement and the support from the fossil fuel industry of hydrogen, is from what you're hearing and seeing in your research, is it a genuine and sincere effort by the fossil fuel industry to try to green itself up, or is it a greenwashing, as this term we've here used, that we are hearing, and it's being used just to add more market share for the fossil fuel industry and lock us into, what was it? What color is it? Brown?
The way it's made
Oh,
with
sorry,
the-
blue or brown rainbows of hydrogen.
Yeah, that's a really excellent question. And I think that I think there are genuine efforts, and I think there probably is a lot of greenwashing too. Because, right, when a company talks about wanting to increase hydrogen or ammonia, if they're not saying we're going to do it with renewable energy, then it is kind of just perpetuating their sort of existing industry. And that's what makes it tricky to think about. It's easy to sort of get excited about the promise of hydrogen, but then it's also tricky to think about, well, yeah, right, if it's just being made with natural gas or with coal, then are we really changing things for the climate? And so I think people are starting to pay more attention to what companies are saying, and so that's probably creating more pressure for these companies when they talk about ammonia or hydrogen to say with renewable energy. I actually just wrote about a company, my story's coming out later today, that got investment from Saudi Aramco, which is the world's biggest oil producer and has an extremely enormous interest in maintaining the status quo. But they're investing in this ammonia startup. And I think, so you see, there's companies that are, they're kind of investing in these companies that are developing technologies to use their fuels, which is kind of one way to promote hydrogen of all stripes. And then also companies that are investing in the production. So it's kind of messy right now, I guess.
It's a shame because it seems like the Saudis could lead the way with all the sunshine they have in, generating vast amounts of green ammonia and green hydrogen just by having, fields of solar that purely power the production of hydrogen and ammonia.
Right, and that maybe could be their long-term strategy as well. I think what's tricky too is in countries that are as kind of solar resource rich, they are starting to increase renewable production, but because that frees up, the less they use at home of oil and gas, the more they can export to the rest of the world and sell. So that's sort of the challenge too.
This conversation also reminds me of the conversation I was having a couple of weeks ago with Caribbean islands that are investing in geothermal energy and building their geothermal assets, because a lot of those islands are volcanic, but they'll produce so much more electricity than they need. Even if they do underwater cables to nearby islands, they'll still have a lot of electricity left over. And so they are thinking about creating hydrogen with the excess electricity to create a new industry and of exporting this hydrogen to markets around the world because they won't need as much. So it seems similar to the Saudi Arabia's potential, but these Caribbean islands are acting on it, from what I've been told. Another question is, so I want to get into the consumer. Is the consumer prepared for the hydrogen economy, or what has to happen to bring the consumer along? When I think of hydrogen, I think of stars and supernovas. So how do we assuage or assuage, however that word, people pronounce it differently, the consumer's fears and about the risks of hydrogen?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I think one thing that sort of made me feel more comfortable with the idea is just realizing how much work is going into developing safety standards and guidelines, and the way that the shipping industry operates and the aviation industry operates. These are highly regulated industries, and the way that they consume and handle and use fuel has so many rules around it for safety reasons in particular. And there are a lot of efforts underway. They're still very far to go, but they're thinking about it, you know, around using ammonia and hydrogen safely. And I think that, right, that doesn't mean like, you know, let regulators or the companies off the hook per se, but it has kind of made me feel less, if sort of the experts and the regulators are saying we are definitely taking this into account, then that makes me feel better as well. But yeah, hydrogen, it's interesting from a consumer standpoint, because if it's not in passenger vehicles, we might not interact with it as much directly, except for long haul trucks. And certainly that will put more fueling stations in our backyards as well. But yeah, that's, I think, I'm not sure if I answered, I think I might just be rambling now.
Well, similar question, or related, I guess, question is, could hydrogen be used to replace natural gas, and could it use the existing natural gas infrastructure that we have of all the pipes? Like out here in the West, we predominantly heat our homes with natural gas, and we have stoves. Many of us have stoves that are natural gas in our houses. Is hydrogen able to replace that, like on a 1-for-1, or would we end up with some stranded assets because the pipes are not the same? Maybe they need to be replaced or something.
Yeah, that's a good question. I know that there is talk about using them kind of interchangeably, and so I think it's possible. To be honest, I would need to look more into this. There is some overlap in ways that you could use the same infrastructure, but when it comes to heating homes, for example, I think a lot of kind of folks in the clean energy space, like, you know, engineers and experts and what have you, are more convinced that electrification is the better solution. So moving to electric stoves or induction stoves, electric heat pumps, or I guess in Boise's case, right, geothermal heating for buildings, and less so kind of piping in gas, whatever, you know, fuel source it might be.
Okay. Greg, you have a question. You want to? I want to make sure we capture it correctly. You want to ask your question?
Well, yeah, just the sort of chicken and egg question of which, you know, how does this work in terms of production versus use, and how do you see that playing out?
Yeah, I think that it is chicken and egg right now, but I think right now with planes in particular, a lot of work is being done to figure out how to use hydrogen, how to fly planes and bigger planes and fly farther with hydrogen. So that's a big piece of it. And then I think it seems like once you're able to solve those engineering challenges, there is enough for ammonia, and hydrogen are both produced in vast quantities today. So in theory, there's enough of those to fuel your plane once you've got it up and running. But then the challenge, right, is that you need more of the green versions of fuel, of which there's very little. So I think maybe once the technology is proven or it's started to be demonstrated, I guess that's an argument that people in the industry are also making as well. Like, let's get these things moving and then we can incorporate the green version. But you definitely, that has to be kind of part of the plan from the start. And ships, I think it's the same as well. The ships, from my understanding, are farther along in terms of the technical adoption or kind of use of hydrogen. But it's certainly not commercial scale, and that's probably a similar equation there.
When you say it's being produced in vast quantities now, that's using fossil fuel.
Right, exactly. Yeah, almost all of ammonia and hydrogen is made using fossil fuels today. There's probably like a negligible amount that's actually green, and it is scaling, but it's still a drop.
One thing that concerns me about is that there's so much demand from the Bitcoin cryptocurrency mining for renewable energy right now that it could take away green hydrogen's it could take away from the hydrogen industry the ability to use green sources, because Bitcoin maybe pays more or the demand is higher, and they already have a track record. Like here out in the Pacific Northwest, we have an entire hydroelectric dams now that are generating electricity just to mine Bitcoin. And so, whereas that could have been used for electrolysis of hydrogen, but so that concerns me that we're creating a lock-in of using using hydrocarbons to produce hydrogen, and that once we become path dependent on that, we will become path dependent on that system going forward.
Yeah, and that highlights a really big and interesting challenge because there's so many sort of potential applications for hydrogen and ammonia. But if all the industries all switch to it at massive scale, right, that creates a lot of kind of competition. And actually this, I mentioned the International Council for Clean Transportation, this report that they came out with on hydrogen aviation, they clarified for them, green doesn't just mean produce using renewable electricity, it means produce using additional renewable electricity, right? So wind or solar plants that were built for the express purpose of making that fuel and not taking it away from powering a house or charging an electric car or running your Bitcoin mine or whatever it is. And I see, Greg, you had a question about kind of established companies versus startups, and I think it's both. I think thinking about aviation, for example, you have Airbus, like I mentioned, is the world's largest engine manufacturer, and they're looking into hydrogen really seriously. Boeing is a little bit more on the fence. They kind of think maybe around 2050. You do see a lot of startups, but I think what's interesting is that these legacy companies are also interested, maybe starting to partner with these startups, and I wouldn't be surprised if you started seeing acquisitions eventually as well.
And how about in the production of hydrogen? As you say, we've got the established fossil fuel companies who want to sort of just reinforce their need in society, but are there any others that are, is it mostly startups in terms of the green side, I suppose?
For production, I would say it's, thinking about ammonia in particular, that's also big fertilizer companies are the ones that are kind of leading that push. I think because, well, they see it, for them, it's a new market. It's not, they can make ammonia for fertilizer and for ships, and they're kind of becoming under increasing pressure. And so and some examples in Norway, they're retrofitting or reconfiguring their existing plants to kind of use electrolysis and renewable energy. So from the production side, I think because of the massive scale and investment required, you are seeing a lot of these large energy companies. And then obviously, like we talked about, kind of those other interests as well. They kind of, if maybe they're greenwashing and they want to use their existing infrastructure for that too.
Yep. Thank you.
That's interesting, because in Idaho here, we have some very large fertilizer companies with ConAgra, Simplot, there's and we also have an abundance of renewable energy. 80% of Idaho's electricity that we produce is already renewable and clean, with solar, wind, hydro power, and geothermal power. So it is an interesting question for Idaho as to whether or not we could create an industry here in our state of helping companies like Simplot and what's the other big one? I'm forgetting another big one that has a huge presence here.
It's been bought and sold a number of times, so it's probably got a new name this week and it'll have a different one next week. I think it's Canadian ownership is, so those are the couple of big ones, but it's surprising. I haven't heard a peep out of them in terms of ammonia production for what we're talking about today, but
yeah,
maybe they are doing it.
Yeah. Well, Maria, we want to be respectful of your time and our fellow members' times as well. So thank you very much for taking some time to speak with us today and educate us about hydrogen and ammonia and what our future economy might look like. Catalin, you want to wrap it up?
Yeah, I was just going to say thanks everyone for attending, and thank you, of course, to Maria for chatting with us about this really interesting topic. So virtual round of applause. And yeah, again, if anyone is interested in joining, the link is in the chat to join our chapter. And next month we'll be having a just general chapter meeting so we can discuss new topics for guest speakers as well. But again, thanks so much to our guest speaker, Maria, and thank you all for attending.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks, everybody.
All right, bye. Take care.
Take care.